I want to tell you about the last 2 kilometers. Everyone asks about the stone. They want to know what it felt like when it spoke, what the light looked like, how a crystal the size of a dining table can hang in the air without any mechanism to hold it. Those are reasonable questions. I have answered them in 3 separate formal depositions, and once in a lecture hall so crowded that people sat on the floor between the rows of seats, and I will keep answering them for as long as anyone asks, because what happened in that subchamber on Hesevar 4 is worth every telling. But the thing that stays with me, the thing that I think about in the dark before sleep, when the leg aches and the quiet gets deep enough, is the 2 kilometers before. I had no light I trusted. My helmet lamp had cracked when I fell, and it threw a cone of light that kept tilting left no matter how I adjusted it, so that everything on my right was shadow, and I navigated partly by feel, pressing one hand to the corridor wall and dragging myself along it. The wall was cut stone, smooth for the first 10 meters out from the main excavation chamber, then increasingly rough as I went deeper, as though the builders had decided that the outermost rooms needed to be beautiful, and the deep rooms needed only to be strong. I found that interesting, even then. Even dragging a broken leg and bleeding from the knee, and rationing my water to what I could carry in one hand, I found it interesting. I suppose that is the pathology of the profession. My name is Edrin Voss. At the time of what I am describing, I was 53 years old. I had been a field archaeologist for 31 of those years, specializing in pre-collapse human colony structures across the outer systems. The ones we built in the early wave of deep space expansion, before the collapse broke the supply chains and left 100 worlds to fend for themselves or die. Most of them died. Hesevar 4 was one of the ones that died clean, if you can call it that. No catastrophe, no war, no plague we have been able to identify. The colony simply stopped. 700,000 people at its peak, a sprawling infrastructure of tunnels and surface platforms and deep mountain vaults, and then nothing. The last dated record we have found is an administrative entry, mundane in the extreme, noting the rotation of a maintenance crew in the lower agricultural tier. 3 days later, nothing. No distress call, no evacuation record, no bodies we have been able to explain. What they left behind was the architecture. I had been on Hesevar 4 for 11 weeks when the accident happened. My team, 5 of us in that rotation, 8 if you count the surface crew who stayed with the landers, had been mapping the deep sublevels of what we called the Mountain District, a complex of chambers and corridors bored directly into the rock of the plateau escarpment on the colony's northern edge. The upper levels had been excavated by 2 previous expeditions. We were going deeper than anyone had gone, past the 3rd sealed bulkhead, into sections where the air processors had never been restored, and where we worked on suit-filtered air and communicated in short bursts to save power. On the 43rd day of the deep survey, a section of ceiling in sublevel 9 gave way. I will not dwell on it. 3 people were killed immediately. A 4th, Senna, our structural engineer, 30 years old, the best reader of load patterns I have ever worked with, survived the initial fall but not the second collapse that followed when we tried to reach her. That was my fault. I made the call to send in the secondary team, and I was wrong about the stability of the adjoining section, and I will carry that for the rest of my life without requiring anyone else to say a word about it. The 5th member of our deep team, a young surveyor named Call, was with me on the far side of the collapse point and was physically unharmed. We were also cut off from the main access corridor. There was a secondary route. There is always a secondary route on a properly planned expedition, and I am meticulous about planning that ran deeper through the mountain before looping back up. It was longer. It required us to pass through the sealed sections we had not yet mapped, which meant we would be doing survey work in emergency conditions, which is exactly the situation that produces the next set of casualties. I knew all of this. I explained it clearly to Call. He understood. We went. Because the alternative was waiting in a section with compromised ceiling integrity for a rescue team that would take 37 hours to assemble and deploy, and I did not think the ceiling would hold 37 hours. 8 hours into the secondary route, I fell. It was not dramatic. There was no hidden shaft, no crumbling ledge. The floor of the corridor was perfectly intact, smooth, solid, exactly what it appeared to be, and I placed my boot wrong on a section of it that had been cut at a slight angle to account for some drainage feature, and my ankle turned. And when I came down hard on a protruding edge of a floor seam, and felt my lower leg go wrong in 2 places. I heard it before I felt it. The feeling came a second later, which is how it always works, the body giving you 1 beat of grace before the pain arrives. Call was 10 meters ahead. He came back immediately. He assessed the leg with the calm that young people sometimes have in genuine emergencies, the calm that surprises them about themselves, and he told me exactly what I had already told myself. The fibula was certainly broken, and the tibia possibly, and we were 900 meters from the nearest point of the secondary route where any serious medical intervention was possible, and we had limited pain management in the kits we were carrying. He was also, though he did not say this aloud, frightened in the particular way that competent young people become frightened when they realize that the experienced person is the one who is down. I told him to go ahead and mark the route and get to the surface. He refused for approximately 4 minutes. I was more persuasive than he was persistent, which is not something I am proud of. A better person would have let him stay, but I needed him to go because I needed the secondary route marked from the inside, and because if the ceiling above us had the same structural pattern as the section that had already collapsed, we might not have the luxury of 2 people moving slowly through it. Call went. He did not want to. He looked back 3 times before the corridor bent and I lost sight of him. That left me. I will not tell you that the pain was manageable. It was not manageable. I tell you that because I think it matters, not for sympathy, which I am not requesting, but because what came after happened to a man who was not operating in any optimal state. I was cold, I was in significant pain, my light was damaged, and I had been underground for the better part of 2 days. I was not at my best. I want that clearly on the record, because some of the accounts I have read of what happened in the subchamber make me sound like a composed and deliberate man who made intentional choices. And the truth is that most of what I did in those last 2 kilometers was simply the continuation of a direction I had already chosen, carried forward by momentum and stubbornness, when better faculties had gone offline. I made a crutch from the collapsed support rod we had been carrying as a survey pole. It was too short by about 12 centimeters, which meant my gait was wrong and the weight was distributed in a way that made every surface of the injured leg complain, but it was weight-bearing and it was better than the floor. I moved. I moved because stopping was the same as dying, and I'm a stubborn man with no particular interest in dying, and because somewhere ahead of me in the dark, according to every instrument scan we had taken from 3 levels above, according to every theoretical model our survey team had built over 11 weeks of work, there was something that had not been explained. The foundation stone. We had detected it indirectly at first, the way you detect things that do not fit, anomalous mass readings. A resonance signature in the stone around it that our acoustics array picked up on the 41st day and could not account for. A sealed subchamber at what appeared to be the geometric center of the entire mountain district complex. Not the physical center of the rock, but the architectural center, the point from which the entire layout radiated like a web from its anchor, if you map the load-bearing logic of every tunnel and chamber and vault on every level above it. We had not gotten to it yet. It was the thing we were building toward. The accident happened 43 days in, which means we were approximately 2 days from reaching it by the planned route. I was going to reach it by a different route, with a broken leg alone. The last kilometer was the worst. The corridor that led to the subchamber's anteroom was wider than the passages above it, wide enough that I could not use both walls at once, which meant I could not lean across for support, which meant I was working the crutch and one hand along the right wall, and trying not to think about the right wall's significance as a load-bearing element in a structure whose ceiling I no longer fully trusted. The light tilted left. The shadows on the right stayed deep. I found that I was thinking, as I moved, about my father. He was a builder, not in the romantic sense, not an architect or an engineer in the titled sense, though he had the instinct of both. He built things. Houses, primarily, in the practical no-nonsense style of the outer colony settlements where we grew up, where a building was judged by its ability to hold against wind and cold, and the particular impatience of a frontier that did not have time for decoration. He had a gift for it that I did not entirely understand until I was much older, a sense of load and weight, and the conversation between horizontal and vertical force that he could not explain in any formal language, but that made everything he built seem settled in the ground in a way that other buildings were not, like they had been there before they were built, like the ground recognized them. He taught me to read a structure the way you read a sentence, looking for the logic, the reason each element was where it was, the intention behind the arrangement. I was not interested in building. I wanted to find things. I became an archaeologist partly to spite him, I think, and partly because the structures I wanted to read were the old ones, the ones where the builder was gone and the intention was buried and you had to work for the logic. But the gift he gave me, the way of seeing, the reading of load and weight and the conversation between forces, that went with me everywhere. It is why I am good at what I do. It is why I could walk through the upper levels of Hesevar 4 and feel, immediately, that whoever built this place had been working from a center, that the whole complex had a logic, a spine, a point from which everything else extended. My father had been dead for 11 years. I thought about him in the dark corridor with the bad light and the broken leg, and I thought, he would have wanted to see this place. He would have put his hand on these walls the way I was putting my hand on them, and he would have understood them faster than I did. That thought steadied me more than any painkiller I had in the kit. The anteroom appeared without warning, which is to say my bad light did not give me enough lead time to register the change in the sound of my own footsteps before I was inside it. The corridor simply opened, and I was in a space that was roughly circular, about 12 meters across, with a ceiling that arched rather than was flat. The first arched ceiling I had encountered in the mountain district, which in itself told me something, because arches are structural choices as much as aesthetic ones, and you do not arch a ceiling in deep rock unless you have a reason. The walls of the anteroom were carved. Not decorated, carved, which is different. Decoration is surface. What I was looking at was structural information, encoded in relief, load diagrams, stress maps. The geometry of the forces that the complex above me was managing, rendered in a visual language that was part technical notation and part something older, something that predated the formal engineering vocabulary of the colonial period. I stopped moving. I stood in the middle of the anteroom and I looked at the walls. Even then, even with the legs screaming and the light wrong and the knowledge that I was alone in a section of a structurally compromised complex on a dead world with no rescue team yet deployed, even then, I looked at the walls for what must have been 6 or 7 minutes, because the carvings were not decorative. They were a record. Someone had stood in this room 12,000 years ago and carved every force that passed through this mountain into its anteroom walls. Someone had wanted whoever came after to understand what was holding everything up. Someone had wanted the next builder to know. I am not a sentimental man. I have spent 31 years digging up the remnants of dead civilizations, and I have learned, you have to learn, or the grief of it hollows you, to maintain a certain professional distance from the human weight of what you find. A tool is a tool. A building is a building. The people who use them are dust. You can admire the craft without breaking your heart over the crafter. I broke my heart a little in that anteroom, just a little. Standing there with my bad light, and my crutch, and reading what someone had left in the walls for the next person who would need it. Then I moved to the inner door. The door was the most sophisticated mechanical element I had encountered in the mountain district, which is not saying nothing. The bulkheads we had unsealed in the upper levels were themselves impressive, balanced on pivot hinges of a design we had spent 2 weeks analyzing before we understood how to open them without triggering the lock mechanism. But this door was different in kind. It was not a bulkhead. It was not, in the technical sense, even a door. It was a threshold, a dense slab of the same pale stone that the carvings were cut from, set into the arch of the inner opening, with no visible hinges, no pivot mechanism, no control surface of any kind. Just stone. Perfectly fitted stone. The gap between the slab and its frame was less than a millimeter on every side, which, over 12,000 years of thermal cycling in a sealed sublevel, is not an accident. That gap had been calculated. Someone had known that this stone in this environment over this span of time would contract and expand in this precise range, and had cut the fit accordingly. It was an engineering statement as clear as any text. I know how long this will stand. I built it for that span. I put my hand on the surface of the slab. I want to be honest about why I did this. It was not an intentional scientific gesture. I was tired. I was in pain. I had been using the right wall of the corridor as a support for the better part of a kilometer, and the surface of the threshold slab was in front of me, and at the right height, and my hand went to it because my hand goes to walls. It is habit. It is 31 years of reading structures through the palms before the eyes catch up. I put my hand on the surface and felt the stone, and the stone was warm. Not warm in the way that stone near thermal activity is warm, a passive warmth, a borrowed heat. Warm in the way that living things are warm, a warmth that had origin, a warmth that came from inside the slab rather than from anything that had acted on it from outside. I took my hand off the surface, I put it back, the warmth was still there. And then very slowly, the threshold slab moved. It did not swing, it did not slide. It descended straight down into the floor in perfect silence without a breath of air displaced, without a sound I could detect, over the course of perhaps 15 seconds until it was flush with the floor and the inner opening was clear. The mechanism for this was invisible to me. I have since spent considerable time with engineers and physicists trying to understand it, and the current best theory involves a counterweight system of extraordinary precision concealed within the wall on both sides, with a trigger mechanism in the surface of the slab itself, a trigger keyed to some quality of the contact rather than simply to pressure. That theory may be correct. It may not be. What I can tell you is that the door opened when I touched it and not before, and that in 11 weeks of survey work, nothing in the mountain district had opened for any instrument or any member of my team in any intentional test we had conducted. I went in. The subchamber was larger than the external dimensions of the anteroom had suggested it should be, which is a thing you notice when you have spent 3 decades measuring the relationship between outer and inner architectural space. The ceiling was higher, much higher, perhaps 20 meters, and arched again, but with a complexity to the arch that the anteroom's single curve did not have. It was a compound arch, a structure in which multiple intersecting curves distributed load across multiple axes simultaneously, and it was, I want to use a technical word and I will, because it is the accurate one, it was perfect. Not competent, not well executed. Perfect in the sense that every curve was precisely where the forces required it to be and not 1 centimeter elsewhere, and the visual result of that precision was a kind of beauty that is purely mathematical, the beauty of a thing that could not be otherwise. The walls here were not carved, they were smooth and they were pale, the same pale stone as the threshold slab, the same stone as the anteroom carvings, but unworked here. Just the natural surface of whatever material this was. I have since had it analyzed in 4 separate laboratories. The results were consistent. It is a mineral composite with no exact parallel in any known geological or synthetic catalog, but with properties that explain everything. It has a thermal memory. It retains heat signatures and distributes them evenly across its structure. It has a piezoelectric response to pressure that is approximately 40 times more sensitive than any naturally occurring piezoelectric material we have tested. It responds to contact. At the center of the room, hanging in the air at approximately chest height, was the stone. I had seen the scans. I had the theoretical model in my head, a crystalline structure, faceted, approximately 2 meters across its widest dimension, pale, suspended without apparent mechanism. The scans did not prepare me for it. No scan does for a thing like that. The scans told me the dimensions and the mass and the approximate composition, but they did not tell me the light. The stone had no light source acting on it. My helmet lamp was the only illumination in the chamber, and it was tilted and partial and gave no more than a working glow. But the stone was lit from within. Not glowing, not actively luminous, lit, the way a crystal is lit when there is a sun behind it, when some distant source is reaching through the structure of it and illuminating every facet separately. Each face of the stone was catching light that was not in the room. Each facet was precisely angled to catch the light it was catching, which means the facets had been cut for it. The angles were not random, not aesthetic. They were calculated to catch a specific light that would not be present in this chamber for 12,000 years, and that was present now, in some quantity I cannot explain. It was beautiful the way the arch was beautiful, with the beauty of things that could not be otherwise. I crossed the chamber. My leg did not improve for crossing it, and the floor of the subchamber was not as even as the anteroom floor, and I moved slowly with the crutch and one hand held out as though the air in front of me needed to be tested. I do not know what I intended. I do not think I intended anything. I was at the end of a long, terrible, exhausting day in a long, terrible, exhausting sequence of days, and I was in the room that had been the reason for 11 weeks of work. And the stone was in front of me, and it was lit from inside, and the door had opened when I touched it, and I had come a long way, alone, with a broken leg, through the dark. I reached out and I put my hand on the stone. The warmth hit first, the same warmth as the threshold slab, the interior warmth, the warmth of a thing that has a temperature of its own. Then the light changed. Every facet of the stone brightened simultaneously, the interior illumination deepening from a subtle embedded glow to something clear and present, warm gold spreading through the pale crystal like dawn moving through cloud. The gold was not a single tone, it shifted, cycling through the warm spectrum, amber to gold to something almost white, and then settling into a deep, steady gold that was the color of old bronze in good light. The light was not blinding. It was not aggressive. It was the light of a thing waking up after a long sleep, gathering itself. Under my hand, the stone began to hum. Not audibly at first. I felt it before I heard it, a vibration that moved from the surface of the stone through my palm and up into my wrist and forearm, a resonance that matched something I could not name, that found a frequency somewhere in the structure of me and amplified it. My teeth did not chatter. Nothing rattled. It was not that kind of vibration. It was the kind that goes through you rather than past you, that uses your body as a medium, that treats your bones as part of its instrument. Then the glyphs came. They rose from the interior of the stone the way patterns rise in deep water when something stirs below the surface. Not inscribed on the outside, not carved into the facets, but visible through the crystal, rising from within, gaining definition as they came up toward the surface. The glyphs were the same language as the anteroom carvings, but more complex, not the structural notation of the load diagrams, but something that underlay that notation, something that the structural language was built on top of. I recognized the shapes the way you recognize a root word in a language you have studied in its evolved form. The ancestry was there, the generation span visible in the simplicity of what I was seeing compared to the complexity of its descendants. This was the original. The anteroom carvings were the translation. The glyphs spiraled. They moved from the interior outward, rising toward each facet and then spreading across the face of the stone in expanding rings, cycling faster as the gold deepened, the pattern becoming denser and more intricate as the stone continued to wake. I watched it the way I watched everything in that room, fully, quietly, without moving. My hand was still on the surface. I had not decided to keep it there. It had not occurred to me to move it. The hum deepened. It had been a single frequency. Now it was a chord, not a musical chord, or not primarily, but a structural chord. The way a building becomes a chord when all its load-bearing elements are engaged simultaneously, and each one is carrying exactly what it was designed to carry, and nothing more and nothing less. I have heard that sound in well-built spaces. You feel it when you stand in the right place in a structure that is under full load and performing as intended, this deep, almost subsonic coherence. I had heard fragments of it before, in the best preserved ruins I had worked. I had never heard it like this, complete. Every element of this chamber, every curve of that compound arch, every smooth wall and fitted floor and the stone at the center and the stone I was touching, all of it engaged at once, all of it under load, all of it carrying exactly its intended weight. The whole room was performing. The whole room was singing. My leg had stopped hurting. I want to note that because it is true and because it was not something I sought and not something I have been able to fully explain. The fractures were still there. Subsequent imaging confirmed that nothing had knitted, that the bone had done nothing it had not already done in the corridor. But the pain was absent. I was standing on the crutch out of habit, not necessity, and the weight on the bad leg was not announcing itself the way it had announced itself every step of the last 2 kilometers. I do not claim a medical event. I claim that, for the duration of what happened in that room, the pain was elsewhere, and I was somewhere else too. The light was gold and the room was singing, and the glyphs were moving, and I was standing in the room my family had been waiting 12,000 years for me to stand in, though I did not know that yet. Then the stone spoke. I have been asked many times what it sounded like. I understand why the question is asked. People want a voice, a pitch, a gender, an accent, a quality they can hold in the mind and replay. I will tell you what I tell everyone, which is the truth. It was not a voice in the sense that you are probably imagining. It did not come from a speaker. It did not come from a particular point in the room. It came from the room, from the stone, from the walls, from the arch above, from the floor beneath, from the air itself, amplified by everything that compound arch was designed to amplify. The stone did not speak. The building spoke. The resonance of the whole structure, focused and shaped by the mathematics that had been built into every element of it, formed language the way an instrument forms a note, not by producing sound but by shaping it, by giving the vibration a meaning. And the meaning was this. First architect, the foundation remembers. 6 words. A designation and a declaration. First architect, not an honorific, not a title handed out for achievement, but a factual identification, a recognition of what I was in the vocabulary of whatever system had built this room and built these walls and built the stone that hung in the center of it. The same way a lock recognizes a key, not because the key is impressive, but because the key is the key, because the shapes correspond, because this particular configuration and no other one opens this particular mechanism and no other one. First architect, that is what I was. The foundation remembers. The second line landed differently than the first. The first line was recognition, it named me. The second line was something else, a promise perhaps, a statement of continuity. The foundation, whatever the foundation was, the system this stone was part of, the infrastructure that 12,000 years had not degraded, the thing that was currently making this entire chamber sing, The foundation was not done. The foundation had been waiting. The foundation had remembered, across 12 millennia, through the death of the colony and the silence and the dust, and all the expeditions that had come before me and touched nothing and got nothing and gone away. The foundation had held the memory of what it was waiting for. I stood there with my hand on the stone and my bad leg that had stopped hurting and my tilted helmet light, that was now almost irrelevant because the gold of the activated stone was throwing more illumination into the room than I needed, and I tried to absorb what had just been said to me. My father's father had been a builder, his father before him, his father before him. I knew the line back 4 generations without effort. I had the family records, the survey of the bloodline that my grandmother had assembled when she was old and wanted to know where we came from. Builders in each generation, sometimes formally trained, sometimes not, always building, always with the gift for it, the reading of load and weight, the instinct for what a structure was trying to say. I had always thought of it as a family aptitude, the way some families have aptitudes for language or for numbers, a talent that aggregated through generations of practice and selection. I had not thought of it as a thing that had been placed there. I thought about it now, because here is what was seeding through me, standing in that room with the stone's warmth in my hand and its voice still reverberating in the structure of the chamber. The colonial records for Hesevar 4 go back 12,000 years to the foundation of the settlement, and before that they go dark, because the records of the early wave of deep space expansion were kept in formats that did not survive the collapse, and most of what we know about who was on those first colony ships is inference from physical evidence and genetic lineage studies. We know populations. We rarely know individuals. We rarely know names. The stone knew a name. Or rather, the stone knew a line, a bloodline, an inheritance, a pattern in the DNA of the person touching it that matched the pattern of whoever had built this room, had built this stone, had built everything above it. First architect. Not the first architect of this mountain complex. The title was older than that, older than Hesevar 4 colony, older than the particular structures in which I was standing. First architect in the way that a founding role carries its name forward, the way a position passes down a line, and the line carries the name of the position it was created to fill. My family had not chosen to be builders. My family had been built to build. The gift I thought was aptitude was inheritance. The instinct my father had for load and weight was not developed. It was received, passed down from someone who had designed this colony's entire structural logic, who had built this stone and programmed it with a recognition mechanism, who had understood that the colony might fall and the records might be lost and the names might be forgotten, and who had hidden the most important thing inside the bloodline of the people who would carry it even without knowing what they carried. You cannot lose a bloodline the way you lose a record. The colony can die. The records can be lost. The stone can hang silent in the dark for 12,000 years. But if the architect's line survived, if even one of them crossed the stars and made children, and those children made children, and the line held even as it forgot itself, even as it mistook inheritance for aptitude and the gift of a vanished civilization for the ordinary talent of a family that liked to build, then the stone would be here. The door would open. And whoever came, limping and alone, and having crawled the last 2 kilometers in the dark with a broken leg and a tilted light, and no one left beside them, would put their hand on the surface and hear what the stone had been holding for 12,000 years. First architect, the foundation remembers. I do not know how long I stood there. The gold light did not dim. The hum did not diminish. The glyphs continued their slow spiral through the crystal, unhurried, patient, the patience of a thing that has already waited 12 millennia and will not be rushed by the fact that it is finally, at last, awake. I think I cried. I am not certain. I am a composed man by training and by temperament, and I have been in situations that would move a lesser composure and held. But I was also alone in a room that had just told me who I was, and I had just crawled 2 kilometers with a broken leg, and the pain was gone, and the stone was warm under my hand, and my father had been dead for 11 years. I think I cried. If I did, I am not embarrassed by it. What I know for certain is that, after some span of time I could not measure, I lowered myself to the floor of the chamber, carefully, using the crutch and the edge of one of the stone's lower facets as supports, and I sat at the foot of the suspended stone with my back against its warmth and my leg out in front of me and my helmet on the floor beside me, and I waited for call to bring the rescue team. The gold light held the whole time. 8 hours, by my suit's chronometer, 8 hours from when I first touched the stone to when I heard voices in the anteroom, and then Call's voice specifically, cracked and relieved, calling my name. The gold held for the entire duration, and then, when the rescue team's lights came through the inner threshold, it stepped back, not extinguishing but quieting, lowering itself to the level of the subambient glow I had first seen, the interior light, the light that had been in the facets before I touched it. The stone did not go dark. It did not sleep again. It simply chose a register appropriate to a room that now had other illumination. The medic told me later that I appeared to be in a state of almost unusual calm for a man who had been alone and injured underground for 8 hours. She seemed to find this suspicious. I explained that I had had company. She looked at the stone, which was glowing softly in its patient gold, and she looked at me, and she did not ask the follow-up question. Some things, even a trauma medic knows to leave alone. I've been back to Hessevar twice since the initial excavation. Both times the stone greeted me, not with the full activation of the first encounter, not the full-throated singing of the chamber, not the rising glyphs, not the deep warmth that makes your fractures stop announcing themselves. A quieter greeting, a brightening when my hand touches the surface, a hum that does not build to a chord but suggests one, the way a musician running a finger along a string suggests the note without committing to it. An acknowledgement. I am here, it says, I remember. First architect. The foundation remembers. The excavation team has now mapped 4 additional subchambers connected to the main stone's location, each one keyed to a different resonance signature, each one containing a different category of the colony's foundational records. The subchamber to the northwest holds what appears to be a complete structural survey of the entire colony's infrastructure. Every load-bearing element, every design tolerance, every system of drainage and ventilation and thermal management, all encoded in the same visual language as the anteroom carvings, and in some additional languages we have not yet fully analyzed. The subchamber to the northeast contains something our linguists are still working through, what appears to be a social architecture, a design for how the colony was meant to function as a community, what roles were meant to exist, and how they were meant to relate to each other, built with the same care and the same mathematical precision as the physical architecture. Someone designed the society the way my father designed houses. Someone designed the human relationships the way an engineer designs load distribution. Someone cared that much about how people would live together. I think about that a great deal. The south subchamber we have not been able to enter yet. The threshold slab there does not respond to me and does not respond to any instrument we have tried, which suggests a different bloodline key, another line of descent from another of the founding architects, whoever and however many they were. We have put out a very quiet, very careful inquiry through the Colonial Lineage Project, looking for anyone whose ancestry traces to the early wave and who has the kind of aptitude profile that the stone might recognize. We have been careful about how we phrase the inquiry, because the world is full of people who want to be chosen, and most of them are not, and we do not want to create false hope or the kind of noise that attracts the wrong attention to a site that needs protecting. But we are looking. The eastern subchamber I have been into 3 times now, always alone, always with the stone's permission in the form of the threshold that opens when I touch it. That chamber contains something I have told no one about except the senior archaeologist on my team and the institutional ethics board that oversees our work on Hesevar 4. I will describe it here only in general terms, because it is not my information to release, and because what it contains will need to be approached with far more care than I am in a position to give it alone. What I can tell you is this: in the eastern subchamber there are records of the other worlds, not Hesevar 4 alone. The colony world we were excavating was one of a network, a planned network, intentionally designed, with a structural logic that operated at the scale of the settled systems the way the mountain district's architecture operated at the scale of the mountain. Someone planned not one colony but many, with the same care, with the same foundational stones at each one, with the same bloodline keys distributed across the families who crewed those early colony ships. The stone on Hesevar 4 was not the foundation. It was a foundation stone, one of many, each waiting, each holding its 12,000-year silence, each ready for the return of the line that carried the key. I sit with this knowledge every day. It is heavy. It is the heaviest thing I have ever carried, and I have had bad days in this profession, days when what I dug up was not the beautiful mathematics of a good building, but the evidence of how badly things can go wrong between people. This is different. This is the weight of knowing that something vast was planned and only partially accomplished, that a network of colony worlds was seeded not just with people and infrastructure, but with the genetic memory of the people who designed them, that somewhere on 100 dead worlds or living ones, in families that think of themselves as builders because they are good at building, there are people who carry a key they do not know they have. First architect, the foundation remembers. The foundation is patient, I know that now. It waited 12,000 years for me to drag myself through a dark corridor with a broken leg and put my hand on a warm stone, and it did not consider that too long to wait. I am 55 years old now, 2 years on from that first encounter, and I am not a young man, and the leg healed, but it healed imperfectly, and I walk with what my colleagues are too polite to call a limp, and what I call a limp because I am not sentimental about my own physical condition. I will not be the one who finds all the other stones. I will not be the one who opens all the other subchambers, or reads all the other records, or locates all the other bloodlines, and brings them to the thresholds that are waiting for them. That is not my work. My work was to get there. To be the first of the line who knew where to look and had the training to read what was in the walls and the stubbornness to crawl the last 2 kilometers when the light was wrong and the leg was broken and everyone else was gone. My work was to be in the room. I was in the room. I put my hand on the stone and the stone recognized me and the foundation remembered, and everything that has to happen next can happen because that much happened first. I did not need to be young. I did not need to be uninjured. I did not need to be anything other than what I was, a 53-year-old archaeologist with a family gift for reading buildings, alone in the dark, moving toward the thing that had been waiting for him. I think about my father. I think about his father and his father before him, and all the careful hands in all the generations back to whoever it was who stood in this mountain on this dead world 12,000 years ago, and built the room and built the stone, and set the lock to the key of their own blood, trusting that the blood would hold, and the line would find its way, and the foundation would remember. The foundation remembered. So will I.